Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss American pilgrimage, a historical journey, or one might say an historical journey, through Catholic life in a new world. In last session, we discussed New Spain. Today, we discuss New France. We follow our process here of kind of having an overview and then specific quotations we like to emphasize. And I will simply say, as an introductory point, that I will reveal in a moment why this is particularly interesting to me. So.
And to me.
And to me.
We'll find out more.
And to me.
Oh.
Mine is more particular, though. So, overall, I mean, how would you contrast this with the New Spain experience?
Oh, there's quite a contrast. I mean, Spain, at the time that Spain was conquering the New World, it became the most powerful European empire in its day, all that gold that they extracted and so on. And France did not have that same stature empire-wise. They were bogged down in the wars of religion on the continent, you know, and they were having a lot of things in a lot of different areas, and so they couldn't make of Canada what Spain attempted anyway to make of Latin America and even North America. But so, you know, there are differences here, and also time-wise, you know, the entrance of the Jesuits is and of course, turned this into a whole different kind of drama than what we saw.
And of course, no apparition of the Blessed Virgin to help things along. That's supernaturally that they were handicapped by not having that intervention.
Well, there are some visions, though, that help them along. To begin Montreal, for example, that was a vision a layperson had.
And then Kateri Tekakwitha, of course, I mean, the devotion to her and her sanctity was also a great boon and blessing to efforts to evangelize New France. So yes, there was obviously supernatural assistance, no doubt about that. But obviously, Our Lady of Guadalupe is in a league of her own, really, and that obviously had a huge impact.
Of course, there weren't 8 million natives to convert like there were down in Mexico City. Also, the fact that they called Montreal, they would call Ville Marie, that was a Mary town, was what the name they gave to it. Another difference to me was the role of lay women and religious women, and also these lay associations, spiritual people coming to New France.
Right, the devotes that were the followers of St. Francis de Sales, who were very serious about their faith and wanted very much to take it with them to the New World, and that's what motivated them to go to the New World. And that's where the connection I have is that my mother-in-law's family can date themselves all the way back to New France.
What year?
At the beginning. My son,
what year?
Well, I don't know which year, but they were one of the early people who came over to Montreal, and hence my husband is a quarter Native American, because those families intermarried, with the Native population. And so that's my connection.
Okay, well, I guess
not mine, but my husband's.
I was going to say, you're through marriage connection goes back, who knows how many thousand years with the Native Americans.
Right.
But I'm 1/4 French. Name was Gauvreau, and my first ancestor that came here came in 1704 from the Vendée in France, which was, as people may know, the serious Orthodox militant Catholic region of France. I'm proud to have found that out. And then came down, his son, Etienne Gauvreau Jr., came down the Mississippi River, Ohio to Mississippi River, to Kaskaskia, which was the original headquarters, so to speak, of New France in the southern in Louisiana territory, you know. And I once visited this church at Kaskaskia called the Church of the Immaculate Conception. I saw outside that it was founded in 1675 by Père Jacques Marquette, S.J., and that's where my ancestors were married and buried.
Wow.
So that's my connection.
That's a good one.
But
That's a good one.
As we're indulging in a bout of Francophilia here, which is makes me uncomfortable in itself. I would say,
Anglo.
I know.
I would say, really, by way of one-upmanship here, that my own French connection goes back to 1066. The name Pearce probably derives from Pierre's, which means Peter's, and it's probably Norman French. So my ancestors probably came over with the conquest in 1066. That's my French blood. And I would say also the thing I love about this book, one of the things I love about this book is I'm something of a tabula rasa. I mean, I arrived in the United States very ignorant of American literature. I've assuaged that somewhat, but I'm still very ignorant of American history, North American history particularly. So I find this very interesting. And as regards my American, French, Canadian, New France connection, my wife's maiden name is Brown, and her father, my paternal father, my father-in-law, is Brown from Missouri, and they think it's probably Brun or de Brun. So he's probably French descent because they've been in Missouri for forever. So again, we've also got an element of the New France, and that's all be the New France that drifted down into what is now the United States.
Yep, there you go. There you go.
Very
People move around. That should be one of the first things we recognize about human history. People move around.
Right. And it's good also not to move around too much.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least some should move around and some should stay home.
Well, you have to discern what God's calling you to do.
That's true. But I certainly think, for example, we have a very mobile culture here. I think I read years ago that the average stay in a home or in a city is 3 or 4 years. It was very small. I don't know. It sounds a little too small to me, but there's something to a homestead, you know.
People reap it.
We need roots. We need roots, and if people don't hang around any one place for any length of time, then they become rootless. And I don't think that's good for culture or for the individual personality and psyche.
So stop moving. I mean, you made one big move, that's for sure. Also, I mean, you have some kind of a connection to the French with Hilaire Belloc, who is one of your spiritual ancestors.
One of my heroes. He's up there on the wall. Yeah, off camera, but he's on the wall.
Yep. Again, in the colonization or the movement into New France, one of the big problems was disease.
Yes.
That seems to be one of the big major players in how this history unfolded.
Yes.
Very sad that it did that way, you know.
Even the Saint Kateri Tekakwitha that you mentioned already, Joseph, lost her parents to smallpox, and she herself contracted smallpox, survived, but it left her scarred and weakened for life. Yeah. So there's no question that the major cause of death to the natives after the Europeans came here was disease that they did not have immunity to.
And also, you know, I think that Christopher Shannon is very good in showing how that was an obstacle to evangelization.
Yes.
Because obviously, quite naturally, the natives associated the newcomers with disease. And you know, that's all of, why should they be listening in a friendly manner to people that have brought, you know, death to them, you know?
Right. That's right. And that mistrust was aided and abetted by their own religious wise men, you know, their shamans and so on, who would try to blame the pestilences on the missionaries. And yes, there was a lot of mistrust because of the disease being spread.
Hey, going to another personal interest of mine, on 81, top of the page, it would take some 30 years after Columbus's discoveries for the French king to hire his own Italian mariner to plant the French flag in the New World. Francis I, the mariner Giovanni da Verenzano, built a bridge in New York. Well, didn't build it, but he got it named after him.
Yeah, he didn't build it. But, well, yeah, because the French were not a naval power. So if they were going to get in on this game of exploration, they were going to probably have to find mariners from other countries. Yeah. And so, yes, they turned to Italy. And, of course, Columbus was Italian, too. So
yes, indeed. Genoa. I've got one thing actually, and this is also so friendly. But on page 80, I've had to put my glasses on because it's a footnote. But the wars of religion.
These footnotes are very small. This was a joint publication of Ignatius Press and Augustine. And I'm going to tell you that if we'd had more, involvement in the topography, we would not have had footnotes, which people over 60 can't read without a magnifying glass.
In my case, yes, but I do like this footnote one here. The so-called wars of religion, because obviously we all called it that. I mean, that's the label that the historians assigned to it. But further, the so-called wars of religion may just as properly be called the wars of state formation. In other words, that the Catholic monarchs was likely to fight rival Catholic monarchs as Protestant enemies of the Church. It was really largely a secular struggle for power rather than a war of religions, with religion being used as the excuse. And I'm very interested actually in checking this book out here that he mentions, William T. Kavanagh, The Myth of Religious Violence, Secular Ideology and the Roots of Modern Conflict. Because obviously we know that the wars of the 20th century were definitely wars of irreligion, all right? They're secular ideologies leading to world war. But even the so-called wars of religion, which, the part of the black legend, that religion causes war, okay? In actual fact, you look at the minutiae, the details, religion is just the excuse people are using to pursue their own secular agendas.
That's right. Cardinal Richelieu of France bankrolled the invasion of the Habsburg dominions by the Swedish king, right? Because Richelieu was more concerned about French power over Austrian Habsburg power than he was about the faith. Let's just be clear.
And back to the Battle of Lepanto, the fact that that the Pope calls a Holy League, and the French and the Austro-Hungarian empires are fighting each other, and the French hate the Austro-Hungarians so much they made an alliance with the Moors, with the Muslims. So
right. And what's so sad about this is that when France and the Habsburg finally get over this rivalry by having the French king marry who? Marie Antoinette, who was who? The daughter of Maria Theresa of Austria. They finally try to broker this peace and arrange a marriage. And what happens? The French Revolution, and it's over. A little late. Yeah.
That's good. I want to say something on page 90. I want to make a snide remark.
Okay.
Anything more edifying prior to that?
Well, just the pointing out that the source of wealth here that's so coveted up here is the fur trade, not gold.
That's right. Yeah.
And you don't think of beaver pelts anymore as being, so valuable. But Back then they were extremely valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I did before we get the snide comment, and there always needs to be room for snide comments. Something a little bit more edifying. Page 85. I love this quote from Samuel de Champlain. For neither the capture of fortresses, nor the winning of battles, nor the conquest of countries is anything in comparison, nor of a price with the conquests which prepare crowns in heaven. And these labors are in themselves praiseworthy and very commendable, in addition to God's commandment, which says that the conversion of the infidel is of more value than the conquest of a kingdom. So that's the vision that we obviously always hope that evangelists will follow wherever they are.
Right.
And I'm moved by that, but then I don't know how sincere these people are.
That's right. You don't know. Exactly. And
I'm not saying they're insincere. I just don't. I'd love to see a secular leader who has that kind of an attitude. Yeah.
And the other thing I learned in this book that I didn't really appreciate before was how the New France leaders were both Protestants and Catholics, because France had just brokered their own peace, with the Huguenots, and were allowing, Protestant officers and so on. Now they got cleaned out later by other people, but the point is that I didn't realize that. I thought it was at this time uniformly Catholic, and it wasn't. In fact, some of them were converts.
It does seem, largely thanks to the Jesuits, that the real evangelization of New France was done by the Catholics, not the Protestants, for whatever reason.
Yes, that's right. That is right.
Well, that's because I don't know if my friend Archbishop Chaput might have listened to one of our broadcasts, but on page 90, a third of the way down, fourth of the way down, the Capuchins refused the mission to Canada. Oh, well, it may have been a wise decision in hindsight. But,
yeah.
And I love this. How did the Jesuits get involved? Page 91. A wealthy and pious laywoman, and by the way, we're recording this on the 97th birthday of a good friend of mine, Father Michael Buckley, S.J., Cornelius Michael Buckley, who was famous for his connections with wealthy and pious laywomen.
They come in handy.
So Antoinette Dupont purchased a share in Biencourt's company, and this is a company that was going to, take all the business monopoly for New France, and then donated to the Jesuits, who thereby secured the right to work in the colony.
Mm-hmm.
How Jesuitical that was.
Yes. He makes kind of a remark along those lines somewhere about the Jesuits. But one thing that was interesting, though, about the Jesuits on that same page, the Jesuits realizing, quote, that in many cases, faith works first through practice and only later through conscious belief, because they were up against trying to evangelize people who they were struggling to learn their language, and they didn't even have words in their language for some of the doctrinal content of Christianity. They weren't even literate in their own language. So how do you bridge all these gaps? And I do praise the Jesuits for their innovativeness in trying to figure out how do you bridge these gaps. And they found out that, well, give them stuff to do. Have them carry candles and incensers and sing and, all these things. And over time,
there's also somewhere in here as well about the fact that they discovered, of course, yes, it's page 106, towards that bottom paragraph, beauty proved a more reliable source of attraction. And then right at the bottom, crucifixes, images of saints, and other instructive pictures aroused the curiosity of natives and often inspired them to ask questions of the missionaries. These informal exchanges became opportunities for sharing the faith outside of more structured catechism classes. Now, where you have a difficulty with language, it's obviously going to be difficult to preach the truth through reason. But if you actually show beauty, pictures, and people can read a picture, they know what a human person is, and that inspires questions, then you have a conversation, right?
And then connected with the things they already believed in, like the Great Spirit Creator, and now the other thing that I realized reading this is that now we know where the myth of the noble savage comes from. The Jesuit what's the name of the
Relaciones, relations, yeah.
What's the things that they wrote? The relations, yes. So here, listen to this description of the natives by the Jesuit Lejeune.
What page? What page?
99, the bottom of 99. He compared the Indians favorably to the heroes of classical antiquity. And this is a direct quote from him. If we begin with physical advantages, I will say that they possess these in abundance. They are tall, erect, strong, well-proportioned, agile. There is nothing effeminate in their appearance. And there was the remark about how court life in France now had become so foppish, pink shoes and white tights. What are guys doing wearing that stuff? Anyway, those little fops that are seen elsewhere are only painted images of men compared with our Indians. I was once inclined to believe that pictures of the Roman emperors represented the ideal of the painters rather than the men who had existed. So strong and powerful are their heads. But I see here upon the shoulders of these people the heads of Julius Caesar, etc.
Yeah. It's also beautiful prose, even in translation.
It is, but you have to give these Jesuits so much credit for going out in those canoes and living with these people and finding the beauty that was there and then trying to bring Christ into that. I mean, they really were the masters of true enculturation, right? And seeing the nobility that these people possessed at the same time that they're cutting off their fingers and carving out their hearts and roasting them for dinner. I mean,
again, on that, Vivian, on page 104, enculturation, this is the hard work part of it, not just showing pictures. About 8 lines down on that page. Upon his return, this is Brebeuf, I think. Upon his return in 1634, he returned to his study of the language. By the end of the mission in 1649, Brebeuf and his fellow Jesuits had composed a thorough French Huron dictionary, an extensive Huron grammar, and a substantial body of Huron language religious material, including hymns, sermons, and a catechism. I mean, that's hard work. And it's also a great deal of love, right? To go to that much trouble to learn not just one language, was it, how many was it? Several languages, and then getting this dictionary and the rest of it.
Right.
Marvelous. And this is a guy who, it says, one of these voyages, to Huronia, went upstream 60 miles in 2 days. Hey, look, you show me someone who could do that.
Yeah,
that's 30 miles a day.
They had to keep up. Those Jesuits had to keep up with those natives in their canoes, or they wouldn't have earned their respect.
Right.
So these Jesuit men who went out into the wilderness like this, these were strong men and also spiritual fathers to these people. Also, the fact that
they weren't wearing pink shoes.
They weren't. Also, the fact that they developed a liturgy in the vernacular. Of course, this was in 1649. This is still page 104. We're talking about 1649-ish. But in 1615, that's when the Chinese Mass began in China after Matteo Ricci went. He died in 1610. I looked this up. But the Mass, the formal permission to say the Mass in Chinese began in 1615. And here we have Masses in the Huron language in the New World. So again, the Jesuits were being pretty gutsy about trying these things to win these people over when these were points of contention back on the continent,
Well, and
in Europe, Latin was the common language that kept the Europeans together. When you go to strange territories, right, China and North America, there's none of that continuum. There's none of that deposit of knowledge. So you've got to meet them where they are, right? And then take it from there,
That's right.
I want to interject a promotional word here for another book by Ignatius Press called Wise Men from the West, which is a republishing of a book on Matteo Ricci, which is a phenomenal story. Really it is. And then I want to circle back, it was made famous recently, the White House Press, but we talked, Joseph, about the importance of beauty when they didn't have the terms and everything. On page 108, bottom of the page, one Jesuit comments, the outward splendor with which we endeavor to surround the ceremonies of the church, the masses, sermons, vespers, processions, and benedictions in the Blessed Sacrament, with a magnificence surpassing anything that the eyes of our savages have ever beheld. All these things produce an impression on their minds and give them an idea of the majesty of God. So again,
Amen.
Beauty saves the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Amen.
Mm-hmm. Beauty and love. I mean, when they saw these men willing to sacrifice, but the reason why they ate the heart of one of the men that they murdered, I don't remember which Jesuit that was, that they ate his heart. It was because they wanted his courage.
Yeah. Yeah.
They wanted his ability to sacrifice
there's
himself.
An ironic, paradoxical, even perverse irony.
Yes.
That actually they reverence him
exactly.
for the courage he showed, but they obviously don't know how to express that correctly.
Yeah, and we have to remember that what wiped out the mission to the Hurons were the incursions by the Iroquois, who were being, by the way, encouraged and funded and everything by the Dutch and armed by the Dutch, by the English, and so on. So what's happening, whatever wars are going on between these powers on the continent and elsewhere, have spilled over into the New World, and so much of this tribal warfare, which already existed before we got here, but certainly was aided and abetted by Europeans fighting over turf.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately what destroyed their mission.
Secularism poisons everything,
Yeah.
I will leave to page 128 unless there's an obstacle in between.
No.
Well, I'll just very quickly, if you don't mind, page 114 towards the bottom, and it connects to the beginning of the chapter, and I think it evokes the spirit with which Christopher Shannon writes this book, which I like. By the 1640s, the heroic age of missionaries would give way to the heroic age of martyrs. All right, and then right at the beginning of the chapter, because it connects with that, and I just love this spirit. It's appropriate. Towards the bottom of page 179, right at the beginning, the martyrdom of the saints, such as Isaac Jogues and Jean de Brébeuf, testified even more eloquently to the triumph of the faith in New France. So the idea that martyrdom is the seed of the church, the blood of the martyrs of the church, and not a defeat, right? You've died, you've been killed, therefore you've lost. No, that's not a true Catholic spirit, and it's not the spirit with which Christopher Shannon writes this book.
Yes, well, and we think of Isaac Jogues, John de Brébeuf and companion as the earliest North American martyrs, but they're a century late, actually. There were Jesuit martyrs in North America a century before that. In 1568 or 1670, in what's now Washington, D.C., right around the Chesapeake Bay, there were several Jesuits who were martyred there.
Oh, really?
Wow. There was an entire Spanish, Franciscan, and Jesuit evangelization of Las Floridas, the Floridas, back in the 1500s. And in fact, before Jamestown, before 1620 or 10, Virginia, there were 30,000 Catholic natives in Florida and 40 missions.
Wow.
They were entirely wiped out because the English, trying to get rid of the Spanish, armed the hostile Indians and they wiped them out. But there was a very flourishing Catholic culture in Florida, Spanish, prior to these North American martyrs. I just want to say that, not to take away from the martyrs, but it's a relatively unknown part of our history.
It is. It was completely unknown to me until you went to Florida and come back and told us.
And there was a campaign a few years back, I haven't heard much of it lately, for the recognition of the Georgia martyrs, and I think they were Franciscans from this period, Savannah and that sort of area that were wiped out and martyred in that early period.
So, page 128, just comes back to something I mentioned in our general survey, 3 lines down, or 2 lines. These settlements distinguish themselves by the unprecedented freedom they afforded for women religious and the laity to assume leadership roles not available to them in the old world. Mm-hmm. That was an important thing. Mm-hmm. And then the same Father Lejeune, the Jesuit, middle of the page, he dubbed these women ces Amazones du Grand Dieu, these Amazons of the great God,
Yep.
And then we mentioned that the pious or devout would be central to the development of the Catholic life in France.
Yes, the very same people who were being mocked on the stage by Molière are over here in New France putting up with, the vicissitudes of life that most French people can hardly even imagine. And anyway, there they are. Well, never mind what Molière has to say. We're going to go build the kingdom of God, properly understood.
And here's an author I recommend instead of Molière. We did not publish her book. She's not a Catholic. Willa Cather.
Oh, yes.
She's well known for Death Comes to the Archbishop in New Mexico, which is a beautiful book. But she also has a book called Shadows on the Rock.
Yes.
About Quebec. And it's very historically accurate. It's very moving.
It's a moving, beautifully written book.
Which I did not know.
Yeah. About these people. The people who were, we have heard a lot about the role of the Jesuits out in the wilderness, but, the lay people who actually built these towns from nothing
And hospitals.
And schools
yeah.
and a civilization. One thing that stands out to me in the Willa Cather novel is French family, a pharmacist, an apothecary who's come over with some of the aristocrats who are, wanting his services in the New World, and his daughter, and there they are growing lettuce in the cellar. Can you imagine you're growing lettuce in the cellar in Canada so you can still eat your salad? And it's not unlike when she describes the Archbishop in New Mexico, his growing of the fruit trees. His growing. So they're bringing with them a whole culture that it's interesting because the Jesuits and other missionaries realized unless you can get these tribal peoples to sort of settle, the nomad is not really able to live the Christian civilization that they really hoped to impart, right? With agriculture, so you can have wheat and grapes for wine and bread. I mean, it really is, there is something to Christianity that requires a cultivation of a kind of
we
life.
can all agree that in one sense of progress, and that's progressing from the hunter-gatherer to the farmer, and that's an essential transition to civilization. And without that, we are literally barbarians, savages, in the bad sense of the word. Not
I always get Cain and Abel mixed up because one was a hunter and one was a farmer.
Cain is the hunter and Abel is the farmer.
Okay.
And so Abel is the no. I'm thinking of Esau and Jacob. Abel is the shepherd and Cain is the farmer. And so Abel brings the best of his flock and Cain brings some of the produce of his fields. But because Abel gave the best of his flock, God was pleased. And then Cain got jealous and the rest is history.
All right. So also I kind of smiled at this thing, page 135, just mentioned Louis XIV and Les Filles du Roi, the daughters of the king, that there are all these orphan girls. And the idea was, well, hey, wait a minute, these guys have no one to marry over. We can't populate the place. And so they were sent over there.
Right, because they couldn't get the demographics that their English rivals south of there were, and if they didn't get the population, they weren't going to be able to hold it. If you can't hold the land by settling it, you won't hold it. Someone else will come and take it.
I have two things to mention on page 143.
Well, 143, that trumps me because I've got 144, so go ahead.
Okay. Well, towards the middle of the page there, Major Washington, that's our future first president of the United States, ambushed a French diplomatic party traveling to present their claims peacefully to the Virginians. Washington and his men killed the French commander and 9 of his men. That's kind of a blot on the history, but I guess we can say
Well, if you put it in the context of the warfare that was going on, particularly the Indian warfare, and when Washington was first given his commission, he was supposed to be subduing hostile Indian forces. And then when we started to see that the rival European powers are arming the different Indian tribes and so on, I mean, hey, it's war. I'm not trying to justify what he did, but I'm only saying that there's a context.
It does connect to what I want to say next on page 144, that there's an irony here that it was the Quebec Act, which allowed religious tolerance of Catholics, that was a significant contributor to the American Revolution, that the Protestants in New England would not accept, would not tolerate the tolerance of the Catholics, and that was one of the reasons that lit the fuse for the American Revolution. So there's an anti-Catholic dimension to the American Revolution here, which is highlighted by Christopher Shannon, for which I'm grateful.
But Washington himself was tolerant of Catholics. In fact, he built the first Catholic church in Virginia with his own money. He didn't worship there himself, but he put up the money so it could be built. Yeah. So,
and also, anyway. I'm very interested. I mean, this concludes the chapter, I think. But on page 146, so I know none of this. I've confessed my ignorance for American history. But this letter from Thomas Jefferson to the religious sisters in New Orleans is very charming. I don't know if you have time to read it, but then the cold water is poured upon it by Christopher Shannon in the following paragraph, right? When he talks about basically Thomas Jefferson's rewriting the Bible to take all the supernatural element out. It's his Enlightenment skepticism. But whatever the reason, the man's a gentleman, right?
Yes.
Nothing else, the man's a gentleman, because his response to those ladies
Yes.
religious habits is very charming, and it does show exactly the best side of religious tolerance, right? Is that
That's
we
right.
can see that these Catholics with their schools and with the other things they're doing are actually contributing towards the common good. And insofar as it's the common good, then that's fine.
And it's kind of a preface to what you said about toleration there. I was surprised to learn this on page 143 at the bottom, 5 lines up. The acquisition of French Catholic Canada, forced because England acquired it, forced England to consider two equally undesirable alternatives. One, force Catholics to convert to Anglicanism, or two, tolerate the Catholic Church within a sovereign British territory. So it's interesting that what led to British tolerance of Catholics was their acquisition of French Catholic Canada. So that was a blessing to the United States of America, which came through, this.
And actually to the United Kingdom, because this set, if you like, a precedent for the fact that we are not going to try to impose the state religion of Anglicanism on people from now on. We have to learn to live with religious minorities. And again, the fact that the Irish and the resistance of the Irish to forced conversion have taught the English a lesson, given the English a bloody nose. You can't force people. And again, in my own people, English Catholics, that heroic resistance for 300 years to forced tolerance. I think that the English government thought you can't force people from one religion to another. You have to find another way of making this work. So I think that the resistance of the Irish, resistance of the English Catholics led to this, and then this sort of modus operandi, should we say. And that also then thought, well, if it works in Canada, right, why won't it work in England? And then you've got this, later that century, we have the first, repealing the anti-Catholic laws coming in.
This building that he mentions, the oldest surviving building in the Mississippi Valley, the Ursuline Convent in New Orleans. My husband and I were just there in spring, and Thomas Jacoby here, our tech guy, he's from New Orleans. New Orleans is a beautiful city with all of this Catholic history there. And this whole history with Jefferson and everything else is in the museum there in the convent that he's describing as the oldest surviving building in the Mississippi Valley. It's definitely worth visiting if you're ever in New Orleans.
Well, at the risk of having our dyed-in-the-wool New Orleans, Louisiana and tech person here, Tom Jacoby, either delete this whole program or at least edit this out. I want to finish with this quote on page 145, because you remember the French were trying to make Quebec and Montreal into the New Jerusalem. And he says here in the new paragraph at the bottom, no one would confuse New Orleans with the New Jerusalem on the model of Quebec or Montreal. Unlike those cities, it was indeed a dumping ground for the dregs of French society. Anyway,
sounds like San Francisco.
The last shall be
and all I would say, Thomas, really just by means of, so that you don't delete the whole program, is that after South Carolina, for which I am patriotically attached, Louisiana is my favorite state in the whole union.
Yeah. All right. Well,
true, Chris.
Yeah. I mean, you're in the land of the deplorables, so that would make sense. So we will then on our next session discuss chapter 3. Joseph, we're going to give you the featured role here. We're going to discuss England in the American pilgrimage. Thanks, everyone. God bless you. See you next time.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumedbookclub.ignatius.com.